Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
this happened a few years ago when I moved into my first apartment alone. It was a modest one bedroom on the second floor of an older building. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and I thought it would be the perfect place to start fresh after a tough breakup. The first few weeks were uneventful, just the kind of peace I was looking for. Then one night, I woke up to a faint tap 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 against my bedroom window. Groggy and disoriented, I dismissed it as part of a dream and rolled over. But it didn't stop. The sound was light, deliberate, and unnerving. My window faced a narrow alleyway with no ledges or fire escapes. No one should have been able to reach it. I told myself it must have been a bird or some debris blown by the wind and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I hesitated before pulling up the blinds. There were no scratches or smudges, no sign that anything or anyone had been there. Still, the sound stuck with me all day. The following night, I was jolted awake at 2:30 a.m. by the same tapping. This time, it was more insistent, almost demanding my attention. I didn't move, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I stared at the window, heart pounding, until the sound eventually stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. By the third night, I was determined to figure out what was happening. I kept the lights off, sat on my bed with my phone in hand, and waited. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the tapping started again. The rhythm was deliberate, calculated, like someone was testing my reaction. I swallowed my fear and aimed my phone's flashlight at the window. For a brief, horrifying moment, I saw a face pressed against the glass, pale, grinning, with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to bore into me. The skin was stretched tight, almost inhuman. As soon as the light hit it, the face vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called the building manager. He seemed annoyed but came to check it out anyway. After inspecting the alleyway and the exterior of the building, he insisted there was no way anyone could have been outside my window. There's nothing to climb on and no way to get up there, he said. You're probably just dreaming. I wasn't convinced. That night, I closed the blinds and hung a heavy curtain over the window. I'd even shoved a chair under the doorknob to my bedroom, just in case. For a week, it was quiet. No tapping, no faces, nothing. I started to believe it was over. Then, one night, I woke up to a new sound, a faint scratching coming from the closet. My heart stopped. I'd always kept the closet door shut, but now it was open just a crack. I stared at it, paralyzed, as the sound continued. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their nails along the inside of the door. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the crack in the door. I waited, breath held, but the scratching stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I got out of bed and approached the closet. My hand trembled as I flung the door open. It was empty, at least at first glance. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small, dirty handprint smeared on the inside of the door. It was fresh. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my phone, and I bolted out of the apartment. I spent the rest of the night at a 24-hour diner, sipping coffee and trying to convince myself this wasn't real. The next day, I called a friend and asked if I could crash at their place for a while. I broke my lease the following week, swallowing the penalty fees just to get out of there. I never figured out how he got to my window or to my apartment. Sometimes I wonder if he had been hiding inside all along, watching me, waiting. After I moved out, I thought I could finally put the experience behind me, but even after settling into my friend's guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I'd hear faint creaks and murmurs that I told myself were just the house settling. Sometimes, though, I'd wake up with that same sense of dread, the feeling I wasn't alone. I started to notice strange little things. My phone's battery would drain faster than normal, even when I wasn't using it. Lights I was sure I'd turned off would be on again when I returned home. My friend insisted it was just stress, that I was jumpy because of what happened, and I wanted to believe her, until the night I found the note. It was tucked under my pillow, a small piece of yellowy paper folded neatly. My stomach dropped as I unfolded it and read the single word scrawled in jagged, childlike handwriting. Hello. I stared at the note, my heart racing. I hadn't left it there, and my friend wouldn't have pulled such a cruel prank. I ran to her room, clutching the paper, and woke her up, demanding an explanation. She swore she had no idea how it got there. Her face went pale as she looked at it, and I could tell she was just as scared as I was. We searched the house together that night, checking every closet, under every bed, even the crawl space in the basement. Nothing, no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there. But I knew someone had. I decided to stay somewhere else after that. I booked a room at a motel on the outskirts of town just for a few days until I could figure out my next move. The first night there, I locked every door and window, double-checked the deadbolt, and propped a chair under the doorknob for good measure. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. My throat went dry. It wasn't coming from the door or the window this time. It was coming from under the bed. I lay there, frozen, listening to the slow, deliberate sound. It wasn't the frantic scurrying of an animal. It was measured, like someone dragging their nails along the wooden bed frame. I wanted to run, but I couldn't make myself move. I didn't even dare to breathe. Then, the scratching stopped. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, when I felt a weight shift on the mattress. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Someone, or something, was climbing onto the bed. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam caught a glimpse of something pale and grotesque scuttling back under the bed. I screamed, bolted out of the room, and ran straight to the front desk. The night clerk called the police, but by the time they arrived, the room was empty. No sign of forced entry, no sign of anything, or anyone under the bed. I didn't stay to argue. I checked out immediately and drove 3 towns over, finding another motel. I didn't care about the cost, I just needed to get away. The thing is, no matter where I go, it keeps happening. The tapping, the scratching, the sense of being watched, it follows me. I've changed my phone, my clothes, even my name in an attempt to start fresh, but it doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's not just tied to that apartment, it's tied to me. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake when I opened that closet door. Maybe it wasn't just hiding in my apartment, maybe I let it out. After fleeing from yet another motel, I started to notice something strange. This wasn't just about being followed. The tapping, scratching, and fleeting glimpses of that grinning face weren't happening randomly. There was a pattern. It always happened at the same time, around 2:30 or 3 a.m., and it always left behind the same subtle traces, small handprints, that eerie word hello, or the feeling of something brushing past me just out of sight. One night, in desperation, I decided to record myself sleeping. I set up my phone on a nightstand, hit record, and left the lamp on a low setting. I didn't sleep much, but I forced myself to lie there, eyes closed, feigning rest. The next morning, with trembling hands, I reviewed the footage. For hours, nothing happened, just me tossing and turning in bed, but around 2:33 a.m., the screen flickered. I thought it was an error, maybe my phone glitching, until I noticed something else. The blanket at the edge of the bed shifted, just slightly, like someone tugging on it. Then, frame by frame, something crawled into view. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it moved closer, I could make out more detail. Pale skin, unnaturally stretched, wide, grinning eyes. It didn't scuttle or lurch like before. It climbed onto the bed, slow and deliberate, and leaned over me. Its face hovered inches from mine. I couldn't hear the sound, but its lips were moving, whispering something. I paused the video, zooming in as much as I could. Its lips formed 2 words, "Thank you." The footage ended abruptly there, as if my phone had been turned off. But I hadn't stopped recording. I threw the phone across the room and bolted out of bed, but as I stood there, the realization hit me it wasn't following me. I was bringing it with me. I thought about every place I'd stayed since leaving my apartment, the friend's house, the motels, the people I'd interacted with. I realized with a sinking feeling that I hadn't just been running, I'd been spreading something. That evening, I called my friend to check in. She sounded off, tired, paranoid. She mentioned hearing strange noises at night, finding little handprints on her walls. I apologized, though I didn't explain why. When I hung up, I sat in silence for hours, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't let it keep happening. I couldn't let more people suffer because of me. But the more I thought about it, the more a terrible question crept into my mind. What if it didn't come from the apartment at all? I started digging through my past, looking for connections. Old journals, photo albums, emails, anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I found it, a journal entry from when I was 10 years old. March 15th, had the dream again last night. The one with the man in the corner. Mom says it's just my imagination, but he feels real. He whispers things, told me he could be my friend if I let him out. I think I said yes. I dropped the journal, my head spinning. The memories came rushing back. I'd forgotten about those dreams, or maybe I'd blocked them out. But now, it all made sense. This wasn't something I'd encountered recently. This thing had been with me for years, lying dormant, waiting for the right time, and I had let it out. This happened to me about 6 months ago, and it still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. For some context, I'm a 24-year-old woman living alone in a small but cozy apartment just outside the city. I've always been pretty vigilant about my safety, double-checking locks, keeping a bat by my bed, you know, the usual precautions. But nothing could have prepared me for this. It was a Friday night, and I had decided to stay in and binge-watch some shows on Netflix. Around 11 p.m., I started feeling a little restless, so I decided to take my dog, Max, for a quick walk. Max is a German Shepherd mix, a big boy who's usually enough to make anyone think twice about messing with me. I grabbed his leash, my phone, and a flashlight, and we headed out. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually is that late. There's a small park about 2 blocks from my apartment that Max loves, so we made our way there. As we were walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I'd stop and look around, but the street was completely empty. Max didn't seem to notice anything unusual, so I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. When we got to the park, I let Max sniff around for a bit while I sat on a bench, scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind me. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and Max's ears perked up. I turned around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, out of the shadows, a man stepped forward. He was tall, wearing a hoodie that obscured most of his face, and he had his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He just stood there, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Max let out a low growl, stepping protectively in front of me. The man didn't say anything. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to figure something out. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back the way he came. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed Max's leash and hurried back to my apartment, constantly looking over my shoulder. The man was gone, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. That night, I triple-checked all my locks and even pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I didn't sleep much, jumping at every little sound, but by the next morning, I convinced myself it was just some weirdo trying to freak me out, and I tried to put it out of my mind. About a week later, I came home from work to find a note taped to my front door. It was written in sloppy, almost childlike handwriting and said, "I like watching you." I felt my stomach drop. I called the police immediately, but they didn't seem too concerned. They told me it was probably a prank and advised me to be careful. Not exactly reassuring. After that, strange things started happening. I'd find items in my apartment slightly out of place, like someone had been there but hadn't wanted me to know. One night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. I live on the 3rd floor. When I looked outside, there was no one there, but I found deep scratches on the glass the next morning. I decided enough was enough and stayed with a friend for a few days while I figured out what to do. The final straw came when I checked the footage from a cheap security camera I'd set up in my living room. In the middle of the night, while I was asleep, a man, the same man from the park, appeared on the footage. He had somehow gotten into my apartment and just stood there, watching me sleep for what felt like an eternity before leaving. I couldn't help but replay the footage over and over, trying to figure out how he'd gotten in. There were no signs of forced entry, and all the locks were still secured. The thought that he might have a key terrified me. I showed the footage to the police, but without any solid evidence of who he was or how he gained access, they couldn't do much beyond filing a report. After that, I started noticing small things I'd overlooked before, faint smudges on my doorframe, as if someone had been handling it regularly, a strange smell in my living room that I couldn't quite place. Even Max seemed more on edge, barking at seemingly nothing. One time, I found my living room window slightly open, even though I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was like he was taunting me, letting me know he could get in whenever he wanted. One night, as I was packing to leave my apartment for good, I heard something that still haunts me, a faint whisper coming from the vent above my bed. It was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it, but Max started growling, his hackles raised. I grabbed a broomstick and prodded the vent cover. Nothing, but when I shined my flashlight inside, I saw a single piece of paper tucked in the corner. I pulled it out, hands shaking. It was another note. This one simply said, "Why are you leaving? We're just getting started." I don't think I've ever felt fear like that in my entire life. I dropped everything, grabbed Max, and drove straight to a hotel. I didn't even lock the door behind me, I just needed to get out. The next day, I arranged for movers to clear out my things while I stayed at a friend's place. I didn't go back to the apartment myself. I couldn't bear the thought of what else might be waiting for me there. Since then, I've moved to a new city, changed my number, and even dyed my hair in case this person somehow found a way to track me. My new apartment is a fortress, multiple locks, security cameras, and I've even installed motion sensors. Max sleeps in my room every night now, and I've never been more grateful for his protective presence. Every so often, I catch myself checking the shadows, listening for footsteps in the quiet. The thought of him, of his silent presence in my apartment, still haunts me. The whispers, the notes, the unshakable sense that I was being hunted, it's left a scar I don't think will ever fully heal. Then, about a month ago, something happened that sent me spiraling again. I was checking my mailbox at my new apartment when I found an unmarked envelope. Inside was a photograph of me walking Max at the park in my new neighborhood. On the back, written in the same sloppy handwriting, was a single word, "soon." I haven't slept properly since. Max and I now only go out during daylight hours, and I've hired a private investigator to try to track down whoever is doing this. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling trapped in a nightmare that doesn't seem to end. A few nights ago, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window. window. My apartment is on the 5th floor. I didn't see anyone when I peeked through the blinds, but the next morning, I found another note taped to my balcony door. It simply read, "You can't run forever. Last night, things escalated further. I woke up to Max growling, standing at the door to my bedroom. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, only to hear faint tapping on the other side. My hands were trembling as I opened the door just a crack, and that's when I saw it, a small, hand-carved figurine of a dog, painted to look like Max, sitting in the hallway. Beside it was another note that read, "You're not as safe as you think." I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the hallway was empty. They found no fingerprints, no sign of anyone being there. I've since installed even more cameras, and Max now sleeps at the foot of my bed every night, his protective instincts on high alert. Yesterday, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank, but the body of the email had a single sentence, "Do you miss me yet?" Attached was a short video of me walking Max, taken from the perspective of someone hiding in the bushes. The timestamp was from that morning, and I forwarded the email to the police and my private investigator, but I've heard nothing back yet. I feel like I'm living in a nightmare, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to make his next move. I've started sleepy with the lights on, but even that doesn't help. To the man who liked watching me, and anyone else who might be helping him, let's not meet. Ever. This happened a few years ago when I was living alone for the first time. I had just moved into a small townhouse on a quiet street at the edge of town. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone kept to themselves, friendly enough for polite nods when passing on the sidewalk, but distant enough that I didn't know my neighbors' names. The house wasn't perfect. It had that tired, worn-in look that comes with age, scuffed hardwood floors, cabinets that didn't quite close, and windows that let the wind whistle through on cold nights. But I didn't mind. I was proud of it. It was mine. The basement, though, was different. It was an unfinished space with concrete floors and walls that seemed to sweat with dampness no matter the weather. The light down there came from a single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows. I used it mainly for storage, boxes of old clothes, holiday decorations, things I didn't have room for upstairs. I hated going down there, but it was functional. That Friday night, I was up late working on a project for my job. My desk was set up in the living room, a cozy spot near the window where I could see the faint glow of the street lights outside. The rain earlier in the evening had stopped, leaving the street dark and quiet. My house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft tapping of my keyboard. I was completely focused on my work when I heard it. Thump. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A dull, muffled sound that came from below me. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. The house made noises sometimes, old pipes groaning, floorboards settling, but this sound was different. It was heavier, deliberate, as if something had been dropped. I shook my head, trying to laugh off the creeping unease. It's nothing, I told myself. The box probably shifted. Still, I couldn't stop glancing toward the basement door. It was shut, as always, but now it felt rugged. I turned up the music on my headphones and forced myself to focus on my work. Whatever it was, it could wait until morning. An hour passed, and I was starting to relax again when I heard it again. Thump, followed by a faint, dragging sound. My blood turned to ice. I yanked off my headphones and sat perfectly still, straining to listen. The house was silent now, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. The air felt colder, heavier, as though it were holding its breath. My eyes darted to the basement door. It was still closed, but now it loomed like a dark figure at the edge of my vision. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was the furnace acting up. Maybe a raccoon had gotten it somehow. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. For a moment, I considered calling the police. But what would I say? I heard a noise. They'd laugh me off the phone. I was an adult. I could handle this. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer and crept toward the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The cold metal sent a shiver through me, and I hesitated, staring at the door as though it might move on its own. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and opened it. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing into the black void below. The basement stairs stretched downward, disappearing into the darkness. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam piercing the shadows. I took the first step, and the wood groaned under my weight. The air grew colder as I descended, carrying that familiar, unpleasant smell of damp concrete and mildew. I swept the flashlight across the room, the beam bouncing off the clutter. Everything looked normal. Boxes were stacked in the corners, the old washing machine sat quietly against the wall, and the shelves were covered in a thick layer of dust. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating, although my voice cracked as I called out, the word barely louder than a whisper. It felt absurd to speak, but the silence was unbearable. I took another step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the beam caught something, a faint glint of light near the small basement window. I stepped closer, squinting. The glass was cracked, not a small crack, but a jagged, deliberate fracture that hadn't been there before. My stomach churned as I shone the flashlight on it, and that's when I saw them. Handprints, faint, greasy smudges on the outside of the glass. Someone had been trying to open the window. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I turned, ready to bolt up the stairs, when the beam caught something else. Scuff marks in the wall. They ran up the plaster, leading to the exposed wooden beams near the ceiling. My pulse quickened as I raised the flashlight higher, following the marks. And then I saw him. A man was crouched in the beams, his body twisted unnaturally to fit in the narrow space. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes glinted in the light like those of a predator. He was grinning, his lips stretched wide to reveal yellow teeth. The smile didn't feel human. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. He just stared at me, unblinking, that grin never faltering. Then, slowly, he shifted. The faint sound of his breath, a low, rasping exhale, broke the silence. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my legs shaking so badly I thought they'd give out. I slammed the basement door shut behind me and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely twist the lock. Then I ran out the front door and straight to my neighbor's house, barefoot and shaking. They called the police while I sat trembling on their couch, clutching a blanket and staring at the door as though the man might come bursting through it at any moment. When the officers arrived, they found him still in the basement, crouched in the beams like some kind of twisted animal. He was armed with a knife, and they found a bag nearby containing duct tape, zip ties, and rope. They told me he'd been there for hours, maybe longer. The sounds I'd heard, those were unmoving, waiting. I moved out the next week. Even now, years later, I can't sit in silence without feeling like I'm being watched. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows sets my nerves on edge. Into the man who was hiding in my basement, watching me from the shadows, let's not meet, ever. 5 years ago, I was on a solo road trip from Colorado to Illinois. I had just accepted a new job and decided to take the long way there, using the trip as an opportunity to clear my head. I was leaving behind a lot, an unfaithful ex, a job I hated, and a town that seemed to suffocate me more every day. I planned the drive meticulously, scenic routes, a killer playlist, and rest stops every few hours. What I didn't plan for was how isolating it would feel once the sun went down. By the 3rd day, I was somewhere in Kansas. The rolling hills and endless fields had been beautiful during the day, but at night, they became a void. The road stretched ahead of me, illuminated only by my headlights, and the darkness on either side felt oppressive, almost alive. Around 11:30 p.m., my gas gauge dipped alarmingly close to empty. My GPS had lost signal miles ago, and I hadn't seen a town or another car for what felt like forever. Just when I started to panic, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. As I got closer, the glow turned into a neon sign, its letters half burned out but still recognizable, gas. Relief washed over me as I pulled in, but that relief quickly turned into unease. The station looked ancient, the paint was peeling, the windows were caked with grime, and the only light came from a single buzzing fluorescent bulb above the pumps. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and a rusty pickup truck sat parked off to the side, its windshield fogged over. I stepped out of the car, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally still, like the world had paused. No wind, no insects, not even the distant hum of a highway, just the crackle of the light overhead and the faint creak of the old gas pump as I filled my tank. That's when I felt it, a sensation I can only describe as wrong, the kind of feeling that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like you're being watched by something you can't see. I glanced around, my heart pounding. The parking lot was empty except for my car and the truck. Beyond the flickering light, the darkness was impenetrable, but the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, more insistent, like invisible eyes were boring into me from somewhere in the shadows. When the pump clicked off, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my car and drive away, but the exhaustion of the road was catching up with me, and I figured a quick snack or coffee might help me push through. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the store. The doorbell gave a weak, mechanical chime as I stepped inside. The air was stifling, thick with a strange, metallic odor that made my stomach churn. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty bags of chips and faded candy wrappers. A few rows of sodas sat sweating in an ancient refrigerator, their labels warped from years of condensation. Behind the counter stood a man. He was tall and gaunt, with skin so pale it looked almost translucent. translucent under the flickery fluorescent lights. His hair was slicked back with grease, and his clothes were stained with something dark and sticky, but it was his eyes that stopped me in my tracks. They were sunken and bloodshot, and they didn't blink. He stared at me with an intensity that felt predatory, like he was trying to peel back my skin and see what was underneath. "Late night drive?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah," I replied, forcing myself to sound calm. He didn't say anything else, just watched as I moved through the aisles. His gaze never left me, and I could feel it even when I turned my back. It was like being studied, analyzed, sized up. I grabbed a bag of chips and a soda, then made my way to the counter. The man's lips curled into a smile as he rang up my items, a wide, toothy grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Where you headed?" he asked, his tone casual but his smile too sharp. "Just passing through," I said, keeping my voice light. He handed me my change but didn't let go of the bills right away. His grip lingered for just a second too long. "You should be careful out there," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Strange things happen on this road at night. A chill ran down my spine. I muttered a quick thanks and hurried out the door. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the cold night air hit my face, but it did little to calm the panic rising in my chest. I glanced back at the store and froze. The man was standing at the doorway watching me, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, deeper in the shadows, was another figure. It was taller and possibly thin, and its head was cocked at an angle that no human neck could achieve. Its limbs were elongated, almost insect-like, and its face, or what should have been its face, was hidden in shadow. But I could feel its gaze, heavy and malevolent, drilling into me. My breath caught in my throat. My legs felt like lead, but somehow I managed to stumble toward my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and tore out of the parking lot. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip the wheel. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man still standing in the doorway, his grin stretching wider. The second figure, however, was gone. I thought I was safe, but 15 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me. A truck. My stomach sank when I realized it was the same rusty pickup from the gas station. Its headlights were blinding, and it was tailgating me so closely I thought it might ram me. Panic surged through me. I floored the gas pedal, but the truck matched my speed, staying just inches from my bumper. I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I told the operator what was happening. Before she could respond, the truck's headlights turned off. I glanced in the mirror just in time to see it veer off the road and vanish into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached a brightly lit rest stop 2 hours later. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. I locked the doors, reclined my seat, and waited for the first rays of sunlight to chase away the shadows. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Was it a prank, a party, or was it something far more sinister? Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that second figure, its impossibly thin limbs and unnatural posture. I wonder if it was human, or if I narrowly escaped something that defies explanation. I didn't leave that rest stop until the sun was fully up. Even then, I waited for a group of people to arrive, a family with 2 kids in tow, their minivan pulling in beside me. Safety in numbers, I told myself. Once they were inside the building, I forced myself out of the car, grabbed a coffee from the vending machine, and splashed some cold water on my face in the bathroom. For a moment, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to convince myself that it was over, that I was safe. But my bloodshot eyes and trembling hands betrayed me. What the hell had I seen back there? The man behind the counter was one thing, creepy, yes, but explainable. A weirdo in a remote gas station, playing games with a lone traveler. But that thing standing behind him, that wasn't human. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But the memory of its distorted silhouette, the way its limbs stretched unnaturally long, made my stomach turn. The rest of the drive was a blur. I didn't take any more detours or scenic routes. I stuck to the highways, kept the car radio on loud to drown out my thoughts, and stopped only at busy gas stations. By the time I reached Illinois, I was running on fumes, mentally and physically. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that second figure in the shadows, its head tilted unnaturally, its gaze piercing even though I never saw its face. I jumped at shadows, flinched at sudden noises, and avoided driving after dark altogether. My friends tried to help me rationalize it. Probably just some guy in a costume. One said, people love to mess with travelers in the middle of nowhere. Or maybe it was just her imagination. Another offered gently, you were tired, stressed out, and alone. Your mind was playing tricks on you. I wanted to believe them. God, I wanted to believe them. But deep down, I knew that what I saw wasn't something my mind had conjured up. About a month later, my curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't told anyone exactly where the gas station was, mostly because I wasn't even sure myself. But I went online and started searching. At first, I didn't find much. The stretch of highway I'd been wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot, and the tiny towns dotting the map didn't have much of an online presence. But then I stumbled across a thread on a local forum. It was titled, "Weird Gas Station Off Route. Anyone else experience this?" My heart dropped. The original poster described stopping at an old gas station late at night, only to have a strange encounter with the attendant. They mentioned the same details: the pale skin, the bloodshot eyes, the unsettling smile. But what really got me was the comments. One user wrote, "Did you see the thing in the shadows?" The tall one. Another replied, "I swear I saw something watching me from the fields when I stopped there. Never went back." But the comment that made my blood run cold was this: "Don't stop there again. People who see the tall one sometimes don't make it out. You were lucky." I closed the browser and slammed my laptop shut, my hands trembling. I tried to put it behind me after that. For months, I avoided anything that reminded me of that night. I focused on my new job, made new friends, and started to feel normal again. But every once in a while, something would happen that brought it all flooding back: a shadow shifting in the corner of my vision, a flickering light, a strange noise outside my apartment at night. And then, about 6 months after the road trip, I came home to find a single, muddy handprint on the hood of my car. It was too large to be human, and after the handprint, things started to change. At first, it was subtle, small inconveniences that could be explained away. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find the lights in my living room on, even though I was sure I'd turned them off. Objects on my desk would be slightly out of place, like someone had been rifling through them. I told myself I was imagining things, that my paranoia from that night at the gas station was finally catching up to me. But then it got worse. One evening, as I was leaving work, I noticed something strange. My car, which I always parked at the far end of the lot, had muddy streaks smeared across the driver's side window. They weren't like the handprint from before. These were long, thin streaks, as if someone or something had dragged their fingers down the glass. I told myself it was just dirt kicked up from a passing car. But when I got inside, the smell hit me. It was faint, but unmistakable. That same metallic, sickly sweet odor I'd smelled at the gas station. I drove home with the windows down, my heart racing the entire way. From that point on, the feeling of being watched became a constant in my life. At first, it was confined to my apartment. I'd catch glimpses of movement and the reflection of my TV or hear faint creaks in the floorboards at night, even though I lived alone. Then it started happening at work. One evening, as I stayed late to finish a project, I noticed a faint reflection in the glass door leading to the hallway. It was there for only a moment. A tall, thin shadow, its head tilted unnaturally, but it was enough to send me rushing out of the building, my laptop forgotten on my desk. After that, I stopped staying late. I stopped going out after dark altogether, but no matter what I did, the shadow followed me. A few weeks later, I decided to take action. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, constantly questioning my sanity. I searched for the gas station online again, this time with a clearer purpose. I wasn't looking for confirmation of what I'd seen. I knew what I'd seen. I was looking for a way to stop it. The forum where I'd read the initial thread was still active, and to my surprise, the original poster had returned. They'd shared another update, one that chilled me to the core. They described how they, too, had started noticing strange occurrences after their visit. They tried to go back to the gas station to confront the man behind the counter, only to find that the station no longer existed. "There's nothing there," they wrote, "just an empty lot. But I swear, I saw tire tracks leading into the field behind it, like something was dragged away." I decided to drive out there myself. It was a stupid idea, I know that now, but desperation makes you reckless. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. What would I even say? That I was being haunted by something from a roadside gas station that might not even exist. Instead, I left in the middle of the afternoon, armed with a flashlight, a knife, and a vague plan to find answers. The drive felt longer than I remembered. By the time I reached the stretch of road where the gas station had been, the sun was sinking low on the horizon. I nearly missed it. The neon sign was gone, as was the building, but the cracked concrete pad was still there, overgrown with weeds. The air was still and heavy, just as it had been that night, and the oppressive silence pressed down on me like a weight. I parked on the side of the road and stepped out of the car, my heart pounding. The lot felt rugged. The same feeling of being watched crept over me, stronger than ever. As I walked closer, I noticed something strange in the dirt. Long, thin drag marks leading away from the lot and into the tall grass beyond. Against every instinct in my body, I followed them. The grass grew taller as I walked, brushing against my jeans and snagging on my jacket. The farther I went, the darker it got, until I could barely see where I was going. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the grass ahead of me. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I took a step forward, then another, until the drag marks ended abruptly in a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was a single object, a gas station sign, its letters faded and cracked, lying on its side in the dirt. My flashlight flickered. That's when I felt it, hot breath against the back of my neck, and the faint sound of something clicking. I spun around, but there was nothing nothing there, or so I thought. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the shadow, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs stretched out in ways that defied reason. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if studying me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to my car. All I know is that I didn't look back, not once. I tore out of there so fast I nearly drove into a ditch, the flashlight still clutched in my shaking hands. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've been staying with a friend, too afraid to be alone. But no matter where I go, the feeling follows me. Last night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open. The same muddy handprints covered the sill, and in the distance, I swear I heard something rustling. I don't know how much longer I can take this. To the man at the gas station, and whatever I brought back with me, let's not meet. It was supposed to be a simple Friday night. My shift at the diner ended at 11 p.m. and I was looking forward to walking the short mile back to my apartment. It's a small town, so I never felt the need to be overly cautious. Everyone knows everyone here, or so I thought. The night was quiet, save for the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I'd walked this route hundreds of times, and it never bothered me before. But that night, something felt off. It started when I noticed the car. It was an old, beat-up sedan parked on the side of the road, its headlights off but engine running. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was just waiting for a friend or taking a break. But as I passed by, I caught a glimpse of the driver. He was staring at me, unblinking, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hoodie. My stomach tightened, but I brushed it off and kept walking. About a block later, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires rolling slowly behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the same sedan creeping along the curb. My heart started to race. I'm not the paranoid type, but something about this didn't sit right. I picked up my pace, clutching my bag tighter. The car kept following me. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him, but he turned too. That's when I knew it wasn't a coincidence. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I tried to remember the self-defense tips my roommate once drilled into me. Stay in well-lit areas. Don't go home. Leave them somewhere public. There wasn't much open at this hour, but I remembered the gas station a few blocks ahead. I made a beeline for it, trying to keep my cool but moving as fast as I could without outright running. The car kept its slow, deliberate pace behind me. When I reached the gas station, I darted inside, the bell above the door jangling loudly. The clerk, a teenager with earbuds in, barely looked up. I went straight to the counter and pretended to browse the candy bars while sneaking glances outside. The car had stopped across the street. The driver was still in it, watching. I'd never felt so exposed. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? Hi, someone's driving slowly behind me. It sounded ridiculous. Still, every instinct screamed that this wasn't normal. I lingered in the gas station for what felt like forever, but the car didn't move. Eventually, I decided to call my roommate, Sarah. She picked up on the second ring, groggy but concerned. Can you come pick me up? I whispered. I'm at the gas station on Main. Someone's following me. Sarah didn't ask questions. On my way, as I waited, I kept my eyes glued to the car. At one point, the driver got out. He stood there for a moment, tall and wiry, his hoodie pulled tight over his head. I couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but I could feel his gaze, sharp and heavy like a weight pressing on my chest. Then, without warning, he got back in and drove off. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. 10 minutes later, Sarah arrived, and as I climbed into her car, I caught a glimpse of the sedan, parked at the end of the block, its headlights on now, watching. Sarah saw it too. Is that a... she asked, her voice tight. I nodded. Let's just go. She didn't be convincing. We sped off, taking a circuitous route home to make sure we weren't followed. By the time we got back to our apartment, the sedan was nowhere in sight. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but a few nights later, I found a note slipped under our door. It was written in jagged, almost childlike handwriting. You're lucky your friend came. We changed our locks, installed a security camera, and I stopped walking home at night. The next few weeks were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, I'd catch a shadow lingering just outside the edge of the camera's view or hear faint footsteps in the hallway late at night. Sarah tried to assure me it was just paranoia, but I knew better. One evening, as I was settling in to watch TV, there was a knock at the door. Sarah was out, so I cautiously peeked through the peephole. No one was there. When I opened the door, a single Polaroid photo was on the ground. It was a picture of me, taken that night at the gas station. My hand shook as I picked it up. In the corner of the photo, written in the same jagged handwriting, were the words, "You look better scared." I called the police immediately. They took the photo and promised to increase patrols in the area, but nothing ever came of it. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, the incident stopped. I moved to a different city not long after, but even now, I can't help but glance over my shoulder when I walk alone at night. Months later, later, I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment when I found something that made my blood run cold. Inside one of the boxes was another Polaroid, this one taken through my old apartment window. It showed me and Sarah sitting on the couch, unaware of the camera. On the back of the photo, written in the same jagged handwriting, were the words, "I found you." I spent the next few weeks on edge, double checking locks, curtains, and my phone for missed calls or strange messages. I even started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, though I knew it wouldn't do much to calm the nightmares that followed. Every sound became a threat, every shadow a potential danger. Then one night, it escalated again. I woke up to a faint tapping noise. At first, I thought it was coming from my window, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from inside my apartment. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, but the screen refused to light up. It was dead. I cursed myself for not charging it and slowly slid out of bed, grabbing the knife from under my pillow. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It led me to the living room, where the blinds were slightly ajar. As I approached, I noticed something on the floor, a single Polaroid, face down. With trembling hands, I picked it up and flipped it over. It was a photo of me, taken from just outside the window. My blood turned to ice as I noticed the timestamp in the corner. It had been taken just minutes earlier. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body screaming for me to move, to run, to do something. Then, a voice came, low and raspy, from somewhere just beyond the glass. "Found you again." I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, my neighbor was pounding on my door, shouting to check if I was okay. When I opened it, shaking and pale, he immediately called the police. They searched the area but found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing but the Polaroid I clutched tightly in my hand. The police assured me they'd patrol the area more frequently, but their reassurances felt hollow. I moved again within the month, leaving behind the apartment, the city, and any semblance of peace I once had. Now, I live in a building with 24-hour security and cameras in every hallway. I never go out alone, and I always keep my phone charged. But no matter how far I go or how safe I try to feel, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. Then came the letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, slipped under my door one rainy afternoon. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for the words, "You can't hide forever." The dread was suffocating. I immediately reported it to the building's security, who reviewed the footage but found nothing. Whoever delivered it had somehow avoided every camera. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. The next morning, I found another Polaroid. This one was taped to my bathroom mirror. It showed me sleeping in my bed, the timestamp marking it from just hours before. My blood ran cold. How had he gotten inside? Desperation drove me to install extra locks, reinforce my windows, and even put a chair under the doorknob at night. I started carrying pepper spray, checking every shadow, and avoiding eye contact with anyone. My life became a constant state of fear, but the real terror came 2 weeks later. I woke up to find my apartment completely silent, too silent. My clock had stopped, my phone was missing, and my knife was gone from under my pillow. The chair I had wedged against the door was neatly placed back in the kitchen. On my bedside table was another photo, me fast asleep with a shadowy figure standing over me, holding my knife. Underneath, written in the same jagged handwriting, were the words, "Let's meet soon." I thought I had reached my breaking point, but the next day, something even more horrifying happened. As I was checking the security footage in the building's office, I noticed a file on the desk labeled with my name. Curious and desperate, I opened it. Inside were surveillance photos, dozens of them, shots of me entering and leaving my apartment, riding the elevator, even standing at my window. My blood turned to ice when I saw the final photo in the stack. It was taken from inside my apartment. I confronted the building's manager, but he seemed genuinely confused and horrified. The file, he claimed, wasn't supposed to exist, and no one on staff admitted to putting it there. The police were called, but they once again came up empty. No fingerprints, no leads, just an ever-deepening mystery. I decided then and there that I had to leave, but even as I packed my bags, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if every corner of my life had been invaded, every shadow corrupted. The last straw came the night before my move. I woke up to the sound of my name being whispered. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again, closer this time, insidious and soft like a knife sliding through fabric. I bolted upright, heart hammering in my chest, and grabbed the knife I had started keeping beside me again. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. There was no reply, just the creak of floorboards outside my room. Summoning every ounce of courage, I threw open the door and flipped on the lights. The hallway was empty, but on the floor was another Polaroid. This one showed my packed bags, the timestamp just moments old. The message beneath it read, "You can't leave my moment. I fled that night, leaving most of my belongings behind. I've since moved across the country, changed my name, and erased as much of my old life as possible. But even now, I can't escape the fear. Every unexpected knock, every strange shadow, every misplaced object sends my heart racing. To the man in the sedan, wherever you are, please, let's not meet again. It was a few years ago when I lived alone in a small, quiet apartment building on the outskirts of town. The building was unremarkable, 3 stories with beige walls, old carpeting, and a faintly musty smell that never went away, no matter how often the landlord claimed to clean it. My apartment was tucked away at the very end of the top floor, farthest from the elevator and stairs. It was the last unit in a long, dimly lit hallway that always seemed darker than it should have been. At first, I loved the privacy. It felt like my own little sanctuary, cut off from the rest of the world. I could go days without seeing another tenant, save for the occasional polite nod in the lobby. But by the time November rolled around, and the days grew shorter and the nights colder, that isolation started to feel more like vulnerability. It was a Friday night, just after Thanksgiving. I remember the air was biting cold, and the wind whipped through the streets as I drove home from work. The trees lining the parking lot were bare, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I parked in my usual spot and glanced around. The lot was almost empty, save for my car and one other, a dark sedan I didn't recognize, parked a few spaces away. The building was as silent as ever when I stepped inside, the only sound the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights in the lobby. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, the soles of my shoes clicking softly against the tile. When I reached the hallway, I paused. Something about it felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The flickering overhead light cast long, uneven shadows that pulled along the walls, making the hallway seem longer than it was. I shook off the unease and walked to my door, my keys jingling softly in the silence. The prickling sensation of being watched made me glance over my shoulder, but the hallway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. My hand fumbled as I unlocked the door, and I quickly stepped inside, locking it behind me with a decisive click. The warmth of the apartment greeted me, and I let out a small breath of relief. My routine of locking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place gave me a fleeting sense of control, as if those thin barriers of metal could protect me from anything lurking outside. I set my bag down, turned on the lights, and went about my evening. After reheating some leftover pasta, I poured a glass of wine and settled on the couch to watch a documentary. It was one of those true crime series that delved into unsolved cases, each episode punctuated by eerie reenactments and ominous narration. That night's episode was about a woman who had been stalked for weeks before disappearing without a trace. The dramatizations were unsettling, especially given how quiet and dark my apartment felt. By the time the episode ended, I was thoroughly unnerved. I turned off the TV, checked the locks again, and decided to head to bed. As I brushed my teeth, I heard faint footsteps echoing in the hallway. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound was so soft, so deliberate, that it almost blended with the whistling wind outside. But as I stood there, toothbrush in hand, the footsteps grew louder, slower, closer. They stopped right outside my door. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I told myself it was probably a neighbor, maybe someone fumbling for their keys. But after a few moments, no knock came, and no jingle of keys. Just silence. The unease prickled at my skin as I tiptoed to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. The light overhead flickered once, casting shifting shadows, but the hallway was empty. I waited a few more seconds, my breath fogging the peephole, before convincing myself I was being paranoid. I double-checked the locks and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old building made me flinch, and the howling wind outside only made the silence inside feel heavier. An hour later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were louder, heavier. My pulse quickened as the steps came to a stop outside my door. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, and then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent against the cold floor, and crept toward the living room. My phone was on the coffee table. I grabbed it, clutching it tightly as I debated whether to call the police. Before I could decide, the sound changed. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. My chest tightened as I backed away from the door. The rattling stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft, deliberate tapping against the wood. It was rhythmic, almost playful, and it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I held my breath, willing myself to stay silent, and then a voice. "I know you're in there." It was low and rasping, barely more than a whisper, but it carried an edge that made my stomach churn. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, her voice calm and professional, but I could barely get the words out. "Someone's at my door," I whispered. "They're trying to get in." The operator stayed on the line, asking me questions. Was I alone? Were the locks secure? Could I see the person? But I couldn't focus. The voice came again, louder louder this time. Let me in. I pressed myself into the corner of the living room, shaking uncontrollably as the doorknob rattled harder. The chain lock jingled faintly, and for one horrifying moment, I thought it might give way. Then came a loud thud, like something heavy slamming against the door. And then silence. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way, but it felt like an eternity before I finally saw the red and blue lights flashing outside my window. When the police arrived, they searched the hallway and the surrounding area but found no one. Probably a prank, one officer said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. I nodded numbly, too shaken to argue. 2 days later, my landlord called. He had reviewed the hallway security footage. There was a man outside your door for over an hour, he said. He didn't knock, just stood there. Did you see his face? I asked, my voice trembling. No, he replied. He kept his hood up. But ... he was holding something. Holding what? A knife. I packed up and moved out within a week. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. I avoid long hallways, flickering lights, and the sound of footsteps in the dark. I never saw him again, but I can still hear his voice. To the man in the hallway, whoever you are, whatever you wanted, let's not meet. I've always loved hiking. Growing up near a state park, the woods became my sanctuary, a place where the constant buzz of life seemed to fade into the quiet rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. I'd spent countless weekends wandering the trails, so much so that I could navigate them with my eyes closed. Well, most of the day, there was one trail I had always avoided, Whispering Pines. It wasn't marked on the official park maps, and the stories about it were the kind of urban legends that stick in your head long after you hear them. People in town whispered about hikers who had vanished there or talked about strange lights seen through the trees at night. Some even claimed they heard whispers when the wind blew through the trees. My parents had always told me to steer clear of it, citing safety concerns. The path wasn't maintained, they said, and it would be easy to get lost. That was all I needed to hear to keep my distance. Until last month, it was a warm set afternoon, and I wanted to try something new. Whispering Pines had loomed at the edge of my thoughts for years, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being irrational by avoiding it. After all, it was just another trail, right? A bit overgrown, maybe, but nothing to fear. I set out just after noon, my usual gear in tow, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. The entrance to Whispering Pines was unremarkable, marked by an old wooden sign hanging crookedly from a single rusted chain. The words Whispering Pines were barely legible beneath layers of moss and grime. The moment I stepped onto the trail, the air seemed different, heavy. It wasn't just quiet, it was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. The first mile was uneventful. The path was overgrown but still navigable, though the trees seemed denser here than anywhere else in the park. Their branches twisted together overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. That's when I noticed the first red string. It was tied around the trunk of a tree, frayed at the edges, as though it had been there for years. I paused, puzzled. It wasn't unusual for hikers or park rangers to leave markers, but something about this felt odd. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but a few minutes later, I saw another string, and another. They were spaced evenly, tied at eye level, leading deeper into the woods. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were fresh, deep, and heading in the same direction I was. They were much larger than my own, and the thought of someone else being out here, unseen, sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was fine. It was a public park. After all, someone else had probably come through earlier. But as I walked further, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was that prickly sensation, the one that makes you glance over your shoulder even though you know no one's there. Except this time, someone was. About 50 feet behind me, partially obscured by a tree, stood a man. He wasn't wearing hiking gear, just a dirty hoodie and jeans. His hood was pulled up, and his face was in shadow, but I could see enough to know he was staring at me. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then, as if he realized I'd seen him, he stepped behind the tree and vanished. My heart was pounding as I turned back to the trail, forcing myself to walk. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to look scared. Maybe he was just some weirdo trying to mess with me. The red strings became more frequent as I went, and the path grew narrower, the trees pressing closer together. That's when I came to the clearing. The shack sat in the center like something out of a nightmare. It was ancient, its wooden boards warped and blackened with age. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly open. The red strings were everywhere now, tied to nearly every tree surrounding the clearing. They seemed to radiate from the shack, as if this place was their source. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me, and I took a step closer. The smell hit me first, something foul, like rotting meat. My stomach churned, and I tried to to convince myself it was just an animal. Then I saw it. Hanging from the ceiling inside the shack was a wind chime, but it wasn't made of wood or metal. It was made of bones. Some were small, like animal bones, but others were larger. Human baby. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping directly behind me. I turned, and there he was. The man was standing less than 10 feet away now, his hood pulled back slightly to reveal a pale, gaunt face. His eyes were hollow, sunken, and fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. He didn't say a word, didn't move. He just stood there, staring. I don't know how long I froze, but when I finally snapped out of it, I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I sprinted down the trail, my lungs burning with every step. I didn't look back, but I could hear him, his heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush, closer and closer. The trees seemed to close in on me, the trail twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. For the first time in my life, I felt completely lost. Finally, I saw light ahead and burst out onto the main road. I stumbled into the path of an oncoming car, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, leaping out to check on me. I barely managed to choke out what had happened before collapsing into their car. The police searched the area later that day. They found the shack but claimed it had been abandoned for decades. They didn't find the wind chime or the red strings, and they didn't find the man. They told me it was probably just my imagination, maybe dehydration or stress. But I knew what I saw. I haven't been hiking since. Into the man in the woods. Let's not meet. It was late, far later than I should have been out. My boss had handed me a last-minute project, the kind that couldn't wait until morning. I was determined to finish it, but by the time I saved the final draft, the entire office had emptied. A glance at my phone confirmed what I already suspected. It was nearly midnight. I sighed heavily and rubbed my eyes, cursing myself for not keeping track of time. The idea of walking out to my car alone at this hour filled me with unease, but what choice did I have? The bus stops were deserted this late, and rideshares were unpredictable in my area. The office building felt different at night. During the day, it was alive with movement, filled with voices, laughter, and the steady hum of work. But now, the stillness felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and distant hum of machinery made me jump. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and headed for the elevator. The long hallway leading to it seemed endless, my footsteps echoing ominously with each step. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, though I knew there was no one left on my floor. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited, my pulse quickening as I watched the floor numbers slowly tick down. When the doors slid open, I hesitated. The interior of the elevator seemed dimmer than usual. The overhead light flickered faintly, casting strange shadows against the metallic walls. I stepped inside, hugging my bag tightly, and pressed the button for the parking level. The ride down was excruciatingly slow. The elevator groaned and rattled, every jolt making my breath hitch. I found myself counting the seconds, trying to distract myself from the unease gnawing at my chest. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a blast of cold air. The parking garage was almost completely silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The garage was massive, with rows of concrete pillars stretching into the shadows. Most of the lights flickered or buzzed intermittently, casting uneven pools of light that made the shadows seem alive. My car was parked in the farthest corner, a decision I now regretted. At the time, it had seemed like a prime spot, easy to back out of and close to the exit ramp. But now, under the dim, flickery light, it felt like a trap. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels clicking against the concrete floor. The sound was deafening in the empty space, echoing back to me in jagged bursts. I clutched my keys tightly in my hand, the sharp edges of the fob digging into my palm. I'd heard enough horror stories to know that parking garages at night were the perfect setting for something terrible. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting between the rows of parked cars, scanning for any movement. About halfway to my car, I heard it, a faint shuffle of footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart lurching into my throat. The sound was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I turned slowly, my breath catching as I scanned the rows of cars behind me. Nothing, just endless concrete and yawning shadows. Hello, my voice trembled as it echoed off the walls. No answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. My ears strained for any sound, any sign that someone else was there. But the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking, though every instinct screamed at me to run. My car was in sight now, just a few steps away. I fumbled with my keys, desperate to reach the relative safety of the locked doors. Then I heard it again. The footsteps were louder this time, heavier. They didn't match my pace. I turned sharply, and that's when I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, partially obscured by the shadow of a large SUV. My breath caught in my throat. He was tall and lanky, his posture slightly hunched. His clothes were filthy, stained, wrinkled, and ill-fitting, and his hair hung in greasy clumps around his pale face. but it was his smile that froze me in place. It was wide and unnatural, stretching across his face like a grotesque mask. His teeth gleamed faintly in the flickering light, and his dark, unblinking eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" I called out, though my voice cracked halfway through. He didn't answer. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought he might be a vagrant, someone looking for shelter, but there was something about him, something predatory in the way he stood there, perfectly still, his grin never wavering. Slowly, he tilted his head to the side, as if studying me. Then, without warning, he took a single step forward. That was all it took. I bolted for my car, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My breath came in shallow, panic gasps as I fumbled to unlock the door. My fingers were shaking so badly that I dropped the key fob. The sound of it hitting the ground echoed like a gunshot. I scrambled to pick it up, my pulse racing as I cast a quick glance behind me. He was closer now, much closer. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled for the lock, and the instant I pressed it, the satisfying click of the door's ceiling felt like a small victory. Then I looked up. He was standing directly in front of my car. My stomach churned. He hadn't made a sound. He was just there. His grin was wider now, his teeth bared in a way that was almost animalistic. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand and waved. My entire body was trembling as I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the concrete as I backed up. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stood there, grinning, watching me as I sped toward the exit. It wasn't until I reached the ramp leading out of the garage that I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. He was gone. The drive home was a blur. Every shadow on the road, every set of headlights in the mirror sent a fresh wave of panic through me. When I finally reached my house, I locked every door and window, double-checked them, and sat in the corner of the living room clutching a kitchen knife. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I went straight to the building's security office. They took me seriously, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in years. They pulled up the footage from the parking garage, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The man had been there the whole time. He'd been lurking in the shadows near the elevator when I stepped out, watching me. When I walked past, he followed, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. The most chilly part, after I drove away, he didn't leave. He stood there for a while, staring at the exit ramp, before turning and walking deeper into the shadows, toward the far corner of the garage where the cameras didn't reach. The police were called, but they didn't find him. I don't stay late at the office anymore. I don't park in garages. Into the man with the crooked grin and silent footsteps. Let's not meet. This happened 3 years ago, during my sophomore year of college. I went to a small liberal arts school surrounded by forest, endless, sprawling woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful during the day, peaceful and serene, but at night, it was different. The kind of different you feel in your gut but can't quite explain. I'd always liked the forest. It was my escape from the stress of classes, my little sanctuary where I could breathe, think, and just be alone. I'd go there to hike, read, or stargaze, and I never felt unsafe. At least, not until that night. It was late October, a chilly Friday night, and I'd just wrapped up a long study session in the campus library. The air outside was crisp, and the moon was nearly full, casting an eerie silver light over the campus. I felt restless, jittery from too much caffeine and too much time cooped up indoors. I needed to clear my head. Grabbing my flashlight and hoodie, I decided to take a quick walk on one of my favorite trails. The trail was familiar, a 2-mile loop that led to a clearing with an incredible view of the stars. I had been there countless times before, both alone and with friends, and I'd never had a reason to feel afraid. The first part of the hike was uneventful. The trail crunched under my boots, and the cool air filled my lungs. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. About a mile in, though, something changed. The forest grew quieter, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The usual background hum of crickets and distant rustling faded, replaced by a stillness that felt rugged. I stopped walking for a moment, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. I laughed nervously to myself, brushing it off. Maybe the chill of the season had silenced the insects, or maybe I was just imagining things. I kept walking, though my pace quickened and my heart started to beat a little faster. When I reached the clearing, I felt a small wave of relief. The moonlight bathed the open space, illuminating the grass and the fallen log I always sat on. The stars above were breathtaking, scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. I switched off my flashlight and sat down, letting the stillness wash over me. But the stillness wasn't calming. not tonight. It was heavy, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees behind me. It wasn't the random scurry of a small animal or the whisper of wind through the leaves. It was deliberate, slow. I froze, my pulse quickening and turning on my flashlight. I swept the beam across the tree line. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled branches and shifting shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing." I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just a dare, or a raccoon, something harmless. I turned off the flashlight and tried to focus on the stars again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My senses felt heightened, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. Then I heard its Giggle. It was soft, high-pitched, and distinctly human. My stomach dropped. It didn't sound normal. It was too airy, too warped, like it was coming from far away and too close all at once. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called, forcing my voice to sound steadier than I felt. No answer, just silence. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint, flickery light in the trees. It was small, like a flashlight, bobbing slightly as if someone was walking off trail. Relief flooded over me at first. Another hiker, I thought, someone else out here. But the light wasn't moving right. It would pause, then dart to the side, then back again. Erratic, unnatural. "Head," I called, waving my flashlight. "Is someone there?" The light stopped. My breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, everything was still. Then the light jerked to the left, disappearing deeper into the woods. I didn't wait to see where it went. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I turned and started back down the trail, walking quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every few steps, I heard it, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. It was subtle, faint, but it was there. Something, or someone, was following me. And then the giggle came again. This time, it was closer. I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing wildly, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to twist and shift in the corners of my vision. The trail felt endless, the darkness pressing in around me. When I finally saw the lights of the campus ahead, I almost cried with relief. I sprinted the last stretch, bursting out of the woods and onto the manicured lawns of the quad. I didn't stop until I was inside my dorm, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My roommate looked up from her desk, startled. "What the hell happened to you?" she asked. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. The sounds, the giggle, the light, it all sounded ridiculous, but I could see the concern on her face. "You said you went to the Claria?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yeah," I replied, my hands still shaking. "Why?" Her face paled. "That's where they found that girl last year, the one who went missing. They found her body just off the trail, near the clearing." I stared at her, my blood turning to ice. "They never caught the guy who did it," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that giggle. For weeks, I avoided the woods entirely. Every time I passed the trailhead, I felt that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. To whoever or whatever was in the woods that night, let's not meet. 2 years ago, I moved to a new city, desperate for a fresh start. My life had unraveled, a failed relationship, a job I hated, and a growing sense that my small town life was closing in on me. I needed to get away, and moving felt like the only solution. The city was supposed to be my new beginning, vibrant, exciting, full of possibilities. But the truth was, starting over wasn't as freeing as I had imagined. I spent most of my time alone, trying to get my bearings. Evenings were the worst. I'd wander the streets near my apartment or camp out at the coffee shop a few blocks away, pretending I had somewhere to be or someone to meet. The shop became my sanctuary, a warm, quiet place where I could distract myself from the loneliness of starting over. It was a Friday night in late fall when it happened. I had stayed at the coffee shop longer than usual, completely absorbed in writing and sipping on my 4th cup of coffee. By the time I glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. The shop was almost empty, and the barista was starting to wipe down tables and stack chairs. I packed up my things, thanked them on my way out, and stepped into the cold night air. The streets were eerily quiet, even for this part of town. Most of the shops were dark, their windows reflecting the glow of the streetlights. The occasional car passed by, but the block was largely deserted. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin and made you wish you'd worn another layer. My breath puffed out in little clouds as I started the short walk home. Normally, I would have taken the main road, a well-lit street lined with businesses and the occasional late-night straggler. But I was tired, and the shortcut through a nearby alley would shave 10 minutes off my walk. I'd taken it during the day plenty of times. It wasn't particularly inviting, but it seemed harmless enough. I hesitated for a moment, then turned toward the alley. As soon as I stepped into the narrow space, a sense of unease crept over me. The alley was darker than I remembered. The faint light from the street barely reached past the entrance, leaving the space ahead cloaked in shadow. The air here felt colder, damp, and heavy with the smell of wet pavement and something metallic. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just an alley, a shortcut. I'd be home soon. My boots clicked against the pavement, the sound bouncing off the brick walls on either side of me. I focused on the faint glow of the exit ahead, trying to ignore the shadows that seemed to press in closer with every step. I was halfway through when I heard it, a faint scuff behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound had been quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. Nothing. The alley stretched out empty behind me, the shadows unmoving. My chest tightened as I scanned the space, my heart pounding in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky and far too loud in the silence. There was no answer. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow and forced. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. It was probably just an echo, or maybe a stray cat. I turned back toward the exit and started walking again, faster this time. Then I heard it again, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. I didn't turn around this time. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but panic was clawing at my chest. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time, my voice trembly. "Who's there?" Silence. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel it. Someone was there, watching me. My hands tightened around the strap of my bag as I forced myself to keep walking, each step faster than the last. The exit was just ahead. I could see the street lights glowing faintly through the narrow opening. "Hey," a man's voice called out behind me, low and casual. "Wait up." My blood ran cold. His tone was calm, almost playful, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I didn't respond. I didn't look back. I read. My boots pounded against the pavement as I sprinted toward the exit, my bag bouncing against my side. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my lungs burning as I pushed myself harder. Behind me, I could hear him running too, his footsteps heavy and fast, closing the distance. I burst out of the alley and onto the main street, the bright lights and open space feeling like a lifeline. My apartment building was just ahead. I ran for the door, fumbling with my keys as I reached it. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them twice before finally shoving the key into the lock. I slipped inside and slammed the door shut, my chest heaving as I locked the deadbolt. For a moment, I just stood there, pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but something told me to look. I moved to the small window next to the door, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. He was there. The man stood across the street under a flickering street light. He was tall, his hood pulled low over his face. He didn't move, but his posture was tense, like a predator watching its prey. Even though his face was obscured, I could feel his eyes on me, cold, calculating, unrelenting. I stood frozen, staring back at him. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed alive. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, wondering what he would have done if I hadn't run. The next morning, I filed a police report, but without a clear description or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. A month later, I saw a news report. A woman had been attacked in that same alley. She survived, but just barely. Her description of the attacker: tall, wearing a dark hoodie. To this day, I wonder if he had been watching me before that night, waiting for the right moment. I avoid that alley now, even during the day. I'm more cautious, constantly checking over my shoulder and staying in well-lit areas. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there. To the man who chased me through the alley, and to whoever else he might be stalking, let's not meet. Ever. This happened about 6 months ago, but it's still as vivid in my mind as the night it happened. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and I work the late shift at a diner about 30 minutes from my house. The drive home is usually quiet, long stretches of empty rural roads with no traffic, no street lights, and barely any signs of life at that hour. Normally, it doesn't bother me. If anything, I find it kind of calming. But that night was different. It was a little past 1:30 a.m., and my gas light came on just as I was halfway home. I groaned out loud because I knew exactly what that meant. There's only one gas station open that late on my route, and it's not the kind of place you stop at unless you absolutely have to. It's this old, run-down station in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz and flicker, and the air smells faintly of burnt oil and stale cigarettes. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't risk running out of gas on a deserted road. When I pulled into the lot, something immediately felt off. The place was completely empty except for one car, a beat-up, rusted sedan parked near the side of the building. Its windows were so filthy I couldn't see if anyone was inside. I parked at the pump closest to the exit, keeping my engine running for a moment as I scanned the area. The lights above the pump were flickering, casting eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. I told myself I was being paranoid. I just needed gas, and then I'd be on my way. I got out and started pumping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was so still, so quiet, that the sound of the gas flowing into my tank felt deafening. That's when I saw him. He stepped out from behind the rusted sedan, and I swear to God, it felt like he materialized out of thin air. He was tall and thin, with greasy hair that hung in uneven clumps around his face. His clothes were filthy, a stained flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. But it was his face that really unnerved me. His eyes were glassy, bloodshot, and wide with this manic energy. And his grin, it wasn't friendly. It was twisted, like he was savoring some private joke that only he understood. "Late night for a pretty girl like you," he said, his voice raspy and low. My heart dropped into my stomach. He was standing too close, just on the other side of the pump, and I hadn't even noticed him until he spoke. I forced a polite smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just heading home from work." He didn't say anything for a moment, just kept staring at me with that unsettling grin. Then he took a step closer, and I instinctively moved back a little, bumping into my car. "You live around here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. His grin widened, showing teeth that were yellowed and crooked. "I could follow you. Make sure you get home safe." My blood turned to ice. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to provoke him. "No, that's okay," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm fine." He didn't move, just stood there staring at me with those unblinking eyes. The pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full, and I've never moved faster in my life. I yanked the nozzle out, spilling gas on the ground in my haste, and shoved it back into the pump without bothering to put the cap on my tank. As I turned to open my car door, I saw him step closer again, and that's when I noticed what he was holding. A knife, a small, shiny blade that he was twirling lazily between his fingers, like he was toying with it. "Don't be in such a rush," he said, his tone mocking. "We're just getting to know each other." I didn't respond. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked, but somehow I managed to fling it open and throw myself inside. I locked the doors and started the engine in one motion. The man just stood there, watching me with that same twisted grin, the knife glinting in the flickering light. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror, praying he wouldn't follow. But a minute later, my worst fear came true. Headlights appeared behind me. It was the rusted sedan. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was leaving too. But as I turned onto the main road, the car stayed right behind me. I took a random left turn, and so did he. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned onto a dirt road I'd never been on before, driving faster than I should have, but he was still there, his headlights growing brighter in my mirror. Panic set in. I didn't know where I was or how to lose him. The road was narrow, with dense trees on either side, and I couldn't risk stopping. Suddenly, I saw a break in the trees up ahead, a small driveway leading to a cluster of houses. Without thinking, I turned onto it, killed my lights, and pulled into the shadows. I held my breath as the sedan sped past. For a moment, I thought he might stop or turn back, but he didn't. The headlights disappeared into the distance, and I sat there in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to move. When I finally pulled back onto the road, I didn't head home. Instead, I drove to a well-lit 24-hour grocery store and parked near the entrance. I stayed there for over an hour, my heart still racing, watching every car that came and went. I never saw the man or his car again, but I can't stop thinking about how close I came to whatever he had planned. I've stopped working late shifts since then, and I'll never stop at that gas station again. After that night, I couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't just the encounter, it was the lingering feeling that I'd been marked somehow. Every time I drove home, I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see those rusted headlights trailing behind me again. For the first couple of weeks, I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I should have done something differently. Maybe I should have gone to the police, but what would I have told them? A creepy guy with a knife at a gas station followed me. There was no license plate that I could remember, no clear evidence of the crime, just fear. I tried to go back to normal, but the smallest thing set me off. I avoided back roads completely, even though it made my drive home longer. I started parking as close as I could to the diner's entrance, sprinting to my car at the end of every shift. I even switched up my routine, taking different routes home every few nights. Still, the paranoia lingered. About a month later, something happened that made me question if I'd truly escaped. It was a Friday night, and I had the weekend off, so I stayed at my friend Carly's place for a movie night. By the time I left her house, it was just after midnight. I didn't think much of it at first. Carly lived in a well-lit suburban neighborhood, and I figured I'd be fine on the way home. But as I turned onto the highway, I noticed a car behind me. It was an old, rusted sedan. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the exact same car. I couldn't be sure, but it was close enough to make my hands tighten. concentrating on the wheel. The headlights stayed a steady distance behind me, not too close, not too far. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. After all, people drive rusted cars all the time, but when I switched lanes, so did they. When I slowed down, so did they. My breathing grew shallow as the dread crept in. Was it him? Was he watching me this whole time, waiting for the right moment? I turned onto an exit I never take, heading into unfamiliar streets, hoping to lose the car. For a moment, I thought it worked. The headlights disappeared when I made a sharp turn down a residential road. My heart began to slow as I made my way back toward the highway, but as I approached the intersection, the rusted sedan appeared again, coming from a side street. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my bag, out of reach, and the last thing I wanted was to pull over, so I did the only thing I could think of. I drove to the police station. I don't think I've ever felt so relieved as when I saw the bright blue and red lights of the station. I pulled into the lot, parked, and sat there with my heart pounding. The sedan slowed as it passed, lingering just long enough for me to get a glimpse of the driver. It was a man. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I saw his silhouette, a tall, lanky figure, and my mind immediately flashed back to the gas station. Was it him, or was I just imagining it? The car sped off before I could think to get the license plate. I went inside the station, shaking as I explained what had happened. The officer on duty was polite but didn't seem too concerned. Without a plate or a clear description, there wasn't much they could do. He told me they'd keep an eye out but suggested it was probably just a coincidence. But I knew better. Since that night, I've changed everything. I moved to a different apartment in a more populated area, and I quit my job at the diner. It's been months, and I haven't seen the rusted sedan again, but I still can't let my guard down. Every time I see an old car or catch someone staring at me for too long, my chest tightens, and I feel that same wave of panic. I don't know who that man was or why he chose me, but the thought that he might still be out there, watching, waiting, it's enough to keep me awake at night. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that grin. That's when I remind myself, he didn't win. I escaped. I'm safe. But deep down, I'm not sure I'll ever really feel safe again. This happened about 2 years ago, and even now, it still creeps me out whenever I think about it. For context, I'm a 28-year-old woman, and at the time, I was living in a small college town, working late shifts at a bookstore cafe. The pay wasn't great, but I loved the quiet atmosphere and my coworkers. The downside, I didn't have a car and couldn't afford rides every night, so I had to walk home. Normally, it wasn't an issue. The route I took was a straight shot down Main Street, which was usually well lit and relatively busy, even late at night. But one night, I made a decision I'll never forget. I decided to take a shortcut. I'd used it a few times before without any problems. It cut through a quiet residential area, saving me about 15 minutes. It wasn't sketchy or anything, just rows of houses with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. But that night, it felt different. The neighborhood seemed darker than usual, like half the street lights were out. There were no porch lights on, no cars passing by, not even the distant sound of a dog barking. The only noise was the rhythmic clack of my boots against the pavement. About halfway through the block, I got the sense that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling, like a sixth sense kicking in, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I glanced over my shoulder and didn't see anything, just the empty street stretching behind me, bathed in dim orange light. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I saw him, a man, walking toward me from the other end of the block. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up and his hands shoved deep in the pockets. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walk at night all the time, but as he got closer, something about him felt rug, and his movements were slow, deliberate, almost like he was pacing himself. And he wasn't walking in a straight line. He was weaving slightly, like he was trying to figure out which side of the street he wanted to be on. I didn't want to take any chances, so I crossed to the opposite sidewalk. As I did, he stopped, just stopped in the middle of the street, standing there like a statue. His head turned slightly, following me as I moved, but he didn't say a word. My heart was pounding as I picked up my pace, trying to act casual but feeling more exposed with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, he was still standing there, watching me. Then, as if on cue, he started walking again, but now he was on my side of the street. That's when the fear really hit. He wasn't just walking, he was mirroring me. Every time I sped up, so did he. When I slowed down, he adjusted his pace to match mine. But the creepiest part, he wasn't making any noise. No footsteps, no shuffle of his clothes, nothing. It was like he wasn't even there, except I could feel him. I thought about running, but my brain was stuck in that fight or flight freeze mode. Instead, I pulled out my phone phone and pretended to make a call, hoping it would deter him. I held the phone to my ear, whispering into it as if I were talking to someone. "Hey, I'm almost home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you meet me outside?" The man didn't react. He just kept walking, that same slow, deliberate pace. My stomach was in knots. I tried to focus on getting to the end of the block, where the street opened up into a main road with better lighting. I told myself that if I could just get there, I'd be safe. But then, he stopped again. This time, he was directly across the street from me, standing under one of the few working streetlights. His hood was still up, casting his face in shadow, but I could see the way his head tilted slightly to the side, like he was studying me. "Hey," he called out, his voice low and almost playful. "Where are you headed?" I ignored him, my heart racing. I didn't want to show him I was scared, but I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. I quickened my pace, gripping my bag tightly and praying I could make it to the end of the street before he tried anything. "Don't be like that," he called again, louder this time. "I just want to talk." I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep moving, to get out of there. Finally, I reached the corner and turned onto the main road, where the bright lights of a convenience store came into view. I felt a wave of relief as I jogged toward it, my eyes darting around to make sure he wasn't following me. When I glanced back, the street behind me was empty. He was gone. I didn't stop to question it. I went straight into the convenience store and stayed there for almost an hour, pretending to browse the aisles while keeping an eye on the door. I didn't see him again that night, but the experience left me shaken. I took a cab home, even though it cost more than I could really afford. For weeks after, I couldn't walk home without looking over my shoulder. I avoided that shortcut completely, sticking to the well-lit main roads no matter how late it was. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even in broad daylight, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows that didn't seem right. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia after all. The man hadn't followed me into the store, and I hadn't seen him since. But something about the way he moved, how he watched me, left a mark I couldn't forget. 2 weeks passed, and life started to feel normal again. I stuck to Main Street on my walks home, and I started carrying pepper spray in my pocket, just in case. For a while, it seemed like everything was fine, until it wasn't. One night, I stayed late at the bookstore cafe to help with an inventory update. By the time I locked up, it was well past midnight. The street was quieter than usual, and I felt that familiar unease creeping in. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the hum of the streetlights sounded louder than it should have. As I walked, I kept my head down, my fingers wrapped tightly around the pepper spray in my pocket. I tried to focus on the sounds around me, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves. But then I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and just far enough behind me to make my skin crawl. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart dropped. It was him, the same hooded figure, walking at that same unnervingly slow pace. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but I knew it was him. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that same sickening dread I'd felt the first time I saw him. I turned back around and quickened my pace, my boots clacking loudly against the pavement. The footsteps behind me sped up to match mine. I clutched my pepper spray tighter, my breathing growing shallow. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my phone was buried in my bag, and I didn't dare stop. The street ahead of me was empty, the nearest open store still several blocks away. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I spotted an alley up ahead and debated whether to duck into it, but the thought of being cornered made my stomach churn. Instead, I kept walking, my eyes darting to every shadow, every parked car, hoping to find some kind of escape. Then, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I risked another glance over my shoulder, but he was gone. The street was empty again, just like before. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't trust it. I knew he was still there, watching, waiting. I practically ran the rest of the way to the convenience store. When I burst through the doors, the cashier gave me a startled look, but I didn't care. I stayed inside for almost an hour, pacing the aisles and pretending to shop. When I finally stepped outside, the street was still empty, but the sense of relief didn't come this time. I knew he was out there, somewhere, and that he'd followed me again. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it just a coincidence? Or was he deliberately targeting me? The thought of seeing him again made my skin crawl, but the thought of never seeing him again was almost worse, like he could be anywhere, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment. A week later, I woke up to a knock at my door. It was early, barely light out, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart sank as I crept to the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything. nothing, just the empty hallway of my apartment building. Then I looked out. There was something on the floor, a small, folded piece of paper weighted down by a single black button. I didn't want to touch it. My hands were shaking as I stared at it, the weight of dread settling over me. Finally, I grabbed a pair of kitchen tongs and picked up the paper, careful not to touch it with my bare hands. I unfolded it slowly, and my stomach turned when I saw what was written inside. "Why don't you take the shortcut tonight?" That was it. No name, no explanation, just that one sentence scrawled in jagged handwriting. The black button felt like some kind of marker, a token of his presence. I didn't know how he'd found me, but he had, and that meant nowhere was safe. I packed a bag that same day and left town, crashing at a friend's place in another city while I tried to figure out what to do. I quit my job at the cafe and never went back to that apartment. Even now, I check my doors and windows obsessively, and I don't walk alone at night, no matter how safe the area seems. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm certain of one thing: he wasn't just a random stranger. He was a predator, and I was his prey. And sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if he's out there, waiting for me to make one wrong move. This happened last fall, and I still get chills thinking about it. I had just moved to a small, quiet town for work, a place where people still leave their doors unlocked during the day and wave to strangers. I thought it would be a fresh start, somewhere peaceful where I could focus on myself. I found a little cottage on the edge of town. It was charming in a rustic way, with a wraparound porch and an old rocking chair left by the previous tenant. Behind the house was a dense forest that stretched for miles. During the day, it was picturesque, but at night, the woods seemed to come alive, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. About a month after I moved in, it was a cool October evening, and I was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I was scrolling through my phone, enjoying the stillness, when I noticed something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a deer. The woods were full of them, and they often wandered close to the house. But when I turned to look, I saw a man dressed in dark clothes, standing just inside the tree line. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the shadows. His face was pale, but I couldn't make out any features from where I was sitting. I froze, my heart racing. "Who just stands in the woods like that?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" No response. He just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow and deliberate, like he was mocking me. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to go inside, but I didn't want to show him I was scared. Instead, I stood up and took a step closer to the edge of the porch. "Hey, you need to leave," I shouted. He tilted his head, like he was amused, then turned and walked back into the woods without a word. I locked every door and window that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside, footsteps on the porch. I shot up in bed, my pulse hammering. The porch light was off, but moonlight streamed through the curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. Then came the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window in my bedroom. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I crept to the window, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and pulled the curtain back just a sliver. He was there, the man from the woods, his face inches from the glass. His features were clearer now, deep-set eyes, stringy hair, and a grin that stretched too wide, showing yellowed, crooked teeth. He stared at me like he was savoring the moment. "Hi," he said, his voice muffled but clear enough to make my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the corner of my bed. How did he know my name? I'd never seen him before, and I hadn't spoken to many people since moving here. My hand shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Before the dispatcher picked up, he spoke again. "You shouldn't have moved here," he said, his grin never faltering. I blinked, and he was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no signs of anyone being outside, no footprints, no disturbed foliage, nothing. They told me it was probably a prank, maybe a local trying to scare the newbie. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after that. For weeks, I jumped at every noise, every shadow. I kept the curtains drawn and the doors locked, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched never went away. I moved out of that cottage after 2 months. The landlord acted surprised when I told him why, but as I was leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "You're not the first tenant to leave early." I never pressed him for details. After moving out of the cottage, I tried to put it all behind me. I found a small apartment in the center of town, away from the woods and far from the cottage, unsettling isolation. It was smaller and noisier, but the hum of passing cars and distant chatter made me feel safe. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. again. I started to convince myself that it really was just a prank, some local weirdo messing with me. But then little things started happening. It began with phone calls. At first, they were silent. I'd answer, only to hear faint static on the other end before the caller hung up. Then, one evening, a call came in while I was watching TV. I let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another telemarketer. But when I played it back, all I heard was slow, deliberate breathing, and then, just before it ended, a voice. "You can't hide." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was raspy, but unmistakable. It was him. I immediately called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The number was untraceable, a burner phone. They said they offered to send a patrol car by my apartment for a few nights, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. Then came the package. It arrived one morning, left on my doorstep without a return address. I remember staring at it for a long time before finally bringing it inside. The box was small and wrapped in brown paper, the kind you find at a hardware store. My name was scrawled on the top in a messy, almost childlike handwriting. I hesitated, debating whether to open it. Finally, curiosity and dread won out. Inside was a single item, a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me taken through the window of my new apartment. In the photo, I was sitting on my couch, completely unaware. I dropped the photo, my hands trembling. He had found me. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows sent me into a panic. I kept all the lights on and sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching a heavy flashlight as if it could somehow protect me. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I called in sick to work and started packing, but before I could leave, the tapping started again. It was late afternoon, and I was in my kitchen, stuffing dishes into a box, when I heard it, soft, deliberate taps against the sliding glass door that led to the balcony. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned to look. He was there, standing on the other side of the glass. His face was pressed so close that it distorted, his crooked teeth bared in that same unsettling grin. "Going somewhere," he said, his voice muffled but unmistakable. I didn't think, I just ran. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the front door, leaving everything behind. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the street, watching me drive away. I didn't stop driving until I was 3 towns over, pulling into the first motel I could find. I stayed there for a week, too scared to go back to my apartment. Eventually, I contacted a movie company to retrieve my things for me. I've since moved across the country to a place where no one knows my name. I changed my number, deleted all my social media, and even started going by a different nickname. For a while, I felt safe again, but last week, I found another package waiting for me at my new address. Inside was another Polaroid. It was a picture of me, asleep in my new bed. I stared at the Polaroid for what felt like an eternity. My blood turned ice cold, my hands trembling so hard I almost dropped it. This was supposed to be my safe place, far from anyone who knew me, or so I thought. Somehow, he had found me again. For the first time since this nightmare started, I broke down. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't run again. Wherever I went, he seemed to follow, like he always knew where I'd be next. The motel felt suffocating after that. Every sound outside my room, the rumble of passing cars, the chatter of other guests, felt like a threat. I couldn't even bring myself to sleep. Instead, I sat in the corner of the room, clutching my phone and staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. I called the police again, this time in my new town, and tried to explain what was happening. But once again, there wasn't much they could do. They told me I'd need to file a restraining order against who I didn't even know. The officer on the phone sounded sympathetic but skeptical. This could just be an elaborate prank. He said, "Is there anyone in your life who might have a grudge against you?" I couldn't answer. There was no one. The following night, things escalated. I had finally drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled to sit up, my eyes darting around the room. It sounded like it had come from the bathroom. For a moment, I thought maybe something had fallen, a loose towel rod or a faulty shelf. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer. The door to the bathroom creaked open, and I saw a shadow stretch across the wall. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I searched for anything to defend myself, my fingers closing around the base of the motel lamp. The footsteps stopped just short of the bed, and then the voice, "You can't keep running." That was all it took. I screamed and swung the lamp with all my strength, sending it crashing into the figure standing over me. There was a guttural sound, something between a laugh and a grunt, before the shadow stumbled back. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, barefoot and still in my pajamas. The motel clerk gave me a confused look as I ran past the front desk, but I didn't stop. I jumped into my car and drove into the night. That's where things start to get strange. I drove for hours, taking random turns and avoiding main roads. I didn't have a plan, I just wanted to get away. Eventually, I found myself in a rural area, the kind where streetlights are rare and the road seems to stretch forever. And that's when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidded to a stop just feet away from him. This time, he wasn't grinning. His face was blank, almost sad. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine through the windshield. "You should have stayed," he said, his voice low and haunting. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could move, everything went black. Not like I fainted, this was different. One moment, I was staring at him, the next, I was waking up in my car, parked on the side of the road. The sun was rising, and the man was gone. I checked the time on my phone, 4:47 a.m. somehow. I'd lost over 4 hours. My car was undamaged, and everything inside was exactly as I'd left it. But there was one new addition, another Polaroid, resting on the passenger seat. It showed me sitting in my car, asleep. I don't know what's happening to me or why he's doing this. It's been weeks since that night, and I've heard nothing from him. Hey everyone, long time lurker, first time poster here. I always loved reading everyone else's creepy experiences, but I never thought I'd have one of my own to share. That changed a few weeks ago. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this. For context, I live in a rural area surrounded by dense woods. It's quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the chaos of city life. I love taking long walks through the trails behind my house, especially in the evenings when the world seems to quiet down. Until recently, those walks were my favorite part of the day. It was a Tuesday night. Around 7:30 p.m. the sun was setting and the woods were bathed in this eerie orange light. I was about halfway through my usual loop when I heard it, a soft voice calling my name, and I froze mid-step. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The wind can play tricks on you when it rustles through the trees. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, and help me. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, off the main trail. It sounded faint, like whoever it was had been calling for a long time and was running out of energy. My first instinct was to call back, but something stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood there, debating what to do, when I noticed how quiet the woods had become. No birds, no insects, just silence. My gut told me to turn around and go home, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail, carefully making my way toward the voice. As I moved closer, I saw him, a man standing in a small clearing. He was tall, with messy hair and clothes that looked torn and dirty, like he'd been out there for days. He wasn't looking at me, just staring off into the distance. Then, without turning his head, he said my name again, and my heart dropped. How did he know my name? I was about to ask him if he was okay when he finally turned to look at me. His eyes were wrong. They were too big, and the whites were grayish, like they'd been clouded over. His smile was even worse, wide and toothy, stretching too far across his face. "Why don't you come closer?" he said, his voice oddly calm. I took a step back. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" His smile grew wider. "I've always known you, Anna." At that point, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I turned and bolted back toward the trail, branches snagging at my clothes as I ran. The whole time, I could hear him behind me. His footsteps were heavy, but they didn't sound like they were on the ground. It was like he was running just above it. When I finally reached the trail, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted all the way home, slammed the door shut, and locked it. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there watching me. The next day, I went back to the woods with a friend, hoping to find some sign of what had happened, footprints, torn clothes, anything. But the clearing where I'd seen him didn't exist. It was just more trees. After a few days, I started convincing myself that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was overworked, or the solitude of living near the woods was getting to me. I even started drafting a text to my therapist about it, but never sent it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but then the noises started. It began subtly, like a faint tapping on my bedroom window late at night. I live in a single-story house, so the idea of someone or something being outside that close sent chills through me. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it as tree branches in the wind, but it happened again the next night. In the night after that, on the fourth night, the tapping wasn't faint anymore. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the glass with their knuckles. I sat frozen in bed, staring at the window, willing myself not to look. I told myself it was an animal, a bird, scared, maybe, but deep down, I knew better, and the voice came again, so close this time it felt like whoever, or whatever it was right next to me. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed my phone, trying to dial 911, but my hands were trembling so much I almost dropped it. The voice called my name again, softer now, but somehow clearer, and then it said something new. "Why did you leave me?" I screamed. I couldn't help it. The moment I did, the tapping stopped, and the air outside felt unnervingly silent. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the blinds, there was no one there, just my dark, empty backyard. The next morning, I checked the window for any signs, footprints, smudges, anything, but there was nothing. No marks on the glass, no disturbed dirt under the window. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I decided to stay with a friend in town for a while. I told them I just needed a break from the isolation of living alone in the woods. I didn't mention the voice or the tapping. I was too embarrassed, and honestly, I didn't think they'd believe me. For a few nights, things were normal. I started to feel safe again, like maybe the whole thing had been a bad dream. But last night, it happened again. I was in the guest room, scrolling on my phone before bed, when I heard it. The same voice, distant but unmistakable, and I'm still here. The sound wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from inside the house. I froze. My friend was asleep in the next room, and I didn't want to wake them, but I couldn't ignore it. I quietly got up and opened the door, peeking out into the hallway. The house was dark and still. Nothing seemed out of place, but the voice came again, closer now. And I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and crept toward the sound. My heart was racing, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the living room, I flipped on the light. It was empty, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the coffee table was a piece of paper, folded neatly. I didn't remember seeing it there before. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. Inside, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words to Camp Hyatt. I dropped the note like it was burning my hands and stumbled back, nearly tripping over the corner of the rug. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. The house was still completely silent, but now it felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. And the voice came again, and this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway leading to the bedrooms. My hands clenched the lamp tighter as I backed toward my friend's room, whispering their name. "Sarah," I hissed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, wake up." I didn't dare take my eyes off the hallway as I reached for her doorknob, but when I turned it and pushed, the door wouldn't budge. Locked. That didn't make any sense. She never locked her door, especially not when I was staying over. "Sarah," I called louder now, pounding on the door. No response. The house felt colder, darker somehow, like the light I had turned on in the living room was fading. And then I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't on the window. It was on the walls. A slow, deliberate knock, 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 moving around me, circling. I was shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the lamp. And the voice whispered, louder now, echoing through the house. "You should have stayed with me." I branded. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get out. I bolted to the front door, threw it open, and sprinted into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the edge of the street, where the first few houses of the neighborhood came into view. Only then did I stop, bending over, gasping for air, my heart threatening to beat out of my chest. I turned back toward my friend's house, and it stood there, still and quiet, like nothing had happened. But the light in the guest room was on now. I hadn't left it all. I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I waited in the cold until the sun started to rise. They walked to the nearest coffee shop, shaking the whole way. I texted Sarah over and over, asking if she was okay, but she never responded. Later that morning, I called the police, telling them I had heard someone in the house. They agreed to do a welfare check, but when they got there, they found nothing. No sign of Sarah, no signs of forced entry. It was like she had vanished. The only thing they found was the note on the coffee table. They bagged it as evidence, but I doubt it'll help. The handwriting wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. I don't know whose it was. That was 3 days ago. I've been staying at a motel ever since, too afraid to go home or even tell anyone else what's happening. But last night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard it again. That same voice, soft and distant but unmistakable. This happened about 2 years ago, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I was a college student living off campus in a small, quiet town. My apartment was just a short drive from campus, but my part-time job often kept me out late. That night was no different. I left work around 10:30 p.m., tired and ready to crash. I had parked my car in the far corner of the lot earlier that day, where the street lights barely reached. It was quieter there, and I didn't mind the walk. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A man was standing next to it. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, leaning against the driver's side door like he owned it. He was dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, his face obscured by the shadows. I slowed down and pretended to check my phone, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned his head slightly like he was watching me out of the corner of his eye. "Oh, excuse me," I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "That's my car." He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. I considered turning around and going back into the store, but my phone was nearly dead, and I didn't want to be stuck there all night. Taking a deep breath, I decided to approach. As I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. He wasn't just leaning against my car, he was gripping the handle of the driver's side door. His knuckles were white, like he was holding on for dear life. "Hey," I said louder, trying to sound angry. "What are you doing?" Finally, he looked at me. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes, though, that's what really got me. They were wide and bloodshot, filled with a kind of frantic desperation I can't even describe. "Don't get in the car," he said, his voice trembling. "Please." I froze. "What are you talking about?" He shook his head violently, still gripping the handle. "You can't go in there. It's in the back seat. It's waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I took a step back, instinctively glancing toward my car's back seat. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside, but his words made my heart race. "Who's in the back seat?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes darting between me and the car like he was fighting some internal battle. Then, without another word, he let go of the handle and bolted across the parking lot, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, completely frozen, until a car drove by and its headlights illuminated my car's interior. My back seat was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got into the car as quickly as I could, locked the doors, and drove home with my heart pounding the entire way. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I walked to my car, day or night, I felt like someone or something was watching me. I told a few friends about the incident, but their reactions were mixed. Most thought the guy was just a drug addict or someone mentally unstable. A couple of them teased me, saying I'd been chosen by a ghost. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging fear. One night, about a month later, I was at a small get-together at my friend Kayla's apartment. After a few drinks, the creepy parking lot story came up. Everyone started sharing their own weird encounters, and I was starting to feel a little better. Maybe my experience wasn't as strange as I made it out to be. That's when Kayla's boyfriend, Mike, cut in. "Hold on," he said, setting his beer down. "Did you say the guy told you not to get in your car because of something in the backseat?" I nodded, subtly feeling uneasy. "Yeah, why?" Mike leaned back, looking serious for once. "That's actually not as uncommon as you think. There's this urban legend, well, maybe it's more than that, about people seeing things in their backseats. It usually happens late at night when they're alone. Some of them describe it as a person, others as something else." "Something else?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Yeah," he said, "like shadows that move on their own, or faces that disappear when they turn around." The freaky part is, in a lot of these stories, someone tries to warn them beforehand, like a random stranger or a homeless guy. And every time, the warning is the same: don't get in the car. The room fell silent. "Okay, but that's just an urban legend, right?" Kayla said, rolling her eyes. "You can't seriously believe that." Mike shrugged. But think about it. How many times do people actually check their back seats? If something was there, you wouldn't even know until it was too late. That thought stuck with me. A few weeks later, it happened again. I was leaving campus after a late study session around midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a couple of cars scattered here and there. I made my way to my car, clutching my backpack and trying not to think about the last time I'd been alone like this. When I got to my car, I froze. The driver's side door was open, just slightly. My first thought was that I must have forgotten to lock it, but that didn't make sense. I was obsessive about locking my car after what had happened. My second thought was worse. Someone had broken in. I stood there, heart racing, trying to decide what to do. Then I remembered Mike's words. Slowly, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. Keeping a safe distance, I pointed the beam into the back seat. Nothing, just my jacket and a few empty water bottles. I let out a shaky breath and laughed at myself for being so paranoid. But as I reached out to close the door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the inside of the window, right above the back seat, were 4 long, smudged streaks like someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. I didn't stick around to investigate. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and drove straight to my friend's house. I couldn't bring myself to go home that night. Since then, I've never parked in that lot again. I've never stayed out late alone, either. I don't know what the man in the parking lot saw that night, or what he thought he saw, but I'll always be grateful for his warning, because sometimes I think about what might have happened if I hadn't listened. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.